Hello, my name is James Ofori, and welcome to my presentation titled The Hedgehog's Dilemma. I will be talking about Shinji Ikari's relationships in the end of Evangelion, using Neon Genesis Evangelion for context. So for those of you who don't know what the Hedgehog's Dilemma is, it's the idea that two human beings, or hedgehogs in this case, may want to get close to each other, but the closer they get, the more they risk hurting each other. In the case of the hedgehogs, their spikes stab each other. This dilemma basically summarizes the struggles of the main characters in Evangelion. So the end of Evangelion is, believe it or not, a movie covering the end of Neon Genesis Evangelion. Who would have guessed? So what is Neon Genesis Evangelion about? For the sake of brevity, I'll say it's about sex and death. Figure it out. It's a kid's show. You're an adult. End of presentation. But seriously, Neon Genesis Evangelion takes place 15 years after a cataclysmic event known as Second Impact. After Second Impact, giant pilotable alien cyborgs are created, known as Evangelions, or Evas for short, to combat mysterious beings known as angels that seek to destroy humanity. It quickly becomes obvious that Evas aren't mere mechs for the main characters to pilot, and actually require a human soul to function, more often than not, the soul of the pilot's mother. This is about one of many of the sources of the psychological trauma that many of the main characters have to face. And as you can see, these robots are quite horrifying. So, before we can get into the characters, first we have to talk about Hideaki Anno, this beautiful man right here, the director and writer of Evangelion. As Evangelion is very much a story closely linked to him as a person and his life. His ideology and a lot of himself flows through almost every character in this series. And so Anno struggled with clinical depression for a long time, and he channels much of that into the Evangelion series, which started to air after he went through a 4-year depression. As he was working on Evangelion, he started to become disenchanted with the otaku lifestyle. This impacted Neon Genesis Evangelion's story quite a bit, and it quickly went from a mecha anime targeted towards children to a more psychological story, deconstructing the mecha genre and breaking down the main characters. This caused the ratings to decline a little bit, but Anno felt that it was important for children to be exposed to this kind of stuff at a young age. Anno is very big on teaching children about the realities of life, and carries this ideal with him in interviews and his other works. He'll often criticize the Japanese animation industry, or just Japanese culture in general. And ultimately, the time slot for the series was changed to a later time, more directed towards adults, and after that, the ratings spiked. And so here I have two quotes that I believe are very important to understanding Evangelion and the time period that it was made in. So his first quote is from a character in the series itself, and the second quote is from an article that I read. And so these two quotes display how damaged the relationships between men and women in Japan truly were during the 90s. The first one emphasizes how difficult it was for men and women to communicate during this time, while the second one emphasizes how badly men needed maternal love or a maternal figure to ease their uncertainty. What's particularly important to realize here is that this was also the time where the category of hikikomori was starting to emerge, and men felt very lost for a plethora of reasons, including the decline in Japan's fertility rates and the financial crisis of the 90s. So how did men deal with this? Sex dolls. Their interpersonal relationships with the opposite sex were severely damaged, as they felt their masculinity was lost in the current climate. But it wasn't just people you would expect to buy these dolls, like otaku. Salarymen also heavily invested in these dolls, feeling that they provided maternal comfort beyond their use for sexual pleasure. Women across Japan certainly didn't take this well. These sex dolls changed beauty standards significantly and made it harder for women to get married and have children. Motherhood had basically become obsolete in their eyes, and as male sex dolls were not being made, women did not have the same things to fall back on as men did. And this actually ultimately resulted in the disposable income of single Japanese women actually overtaking that of single Japanese men. And so now on to the character relationships. So to talk about the character relationships, first we need to know the characters. So let's start with Gendo Ikari. So Gendo is the leader of Nerve, an organization created to combat the angels. Gendo is extremely selfish right off the bat. He moves towards what he wants without thinking about the things that he destroys on the way or the things that he leaves behind. And one of the most crucial things that he leaves behind is his son, Shinji. And so Shinji is introduced into the story when Gendo calls upon him to pilot an Eva. This isn't done very nicely, as you can see, certainly not the way to address your 14-year-old son that you haven't seen in a few years. So a good way to summarize Shinji's character would be through this scenario. You're in a room with Shinji and you tell him to play the violin, then leave the room. One day later, you come back and Shinji is still playing the violin, as you never told him to stop, and he tells you that he hates playing the violin. Among other issues, Shinji suffers from severe depression. Shinji is a very passive person, mainly due to his childhood. His mother, Yui Ikari, died when he was young, and his father left him soon after, leaving him to live with his teacher. Him quietly obeying what others tell him to do is a survival mechanism of sorts, as he thinks being disobedient will lead to him being abandoned again. So he generally does things for the sole purpose of being praised, even if he doesn't want to do it, because he believes people hate him by default. He often states this, and when he is about to give up on something, he'll often repeat the phrase, "I mustn't run away." And his ideal life is basically finding something that he likes to do and doing nothing but that over and over. But he is frequently stopped from working towards this by being forced to pilot his Eva. But perhaps Shinji's most noticeable trait, however, is that he's unbelievably awkward, especially around women. This goes beyond him just being an awkward teenager. He simply doesn't even know where to begin when approaching somebody of the opposite sex. And once he gets into a situation or a conversation, he is just unbelievably incompetent at anything involving keeping it going. So for Shinji and Gendo's relationship, both Shinji and Gendo share this trait where they believe that being close to others will simultaneously cause themselves and others pain. This is why Gendo abandons Shinji, and why Shinji in turn has trouble forming meaningful bonds, with the closest thing he has to a healthy relationship being with Rei. Shinji is also always portrayed as being below or smaller than Gendo. This is very important, as it essentially encapsulates how their relationship works in one image. Looking back to the quotes from earlier, you can see that the state of Shinji and Gendo's relationship is caused by the death of Yui. Had she not died, or had they still had a maternal figure in their lives, their relationship would actually be fine, as that maternal figure is what kept them together. Since they both require the love of one maternal figure, but they don't have any sort of doll to get that from, or do they? Rei is a clone of Shinji's mother. It's a little more complicated than that, but for the sake of brevity, she's one of many mass-produced clones, and the clones themselves are actually soulless. This basically makes her Shinji's sister/mother. She's relatively emotionless, not really going out of her own way to form bonds with others, and simply doing her job of piloting her Eva. She's similar to Shinji in the sense that she just does whatever Gendo tells her to, as he created her. Rei feels like things that she does are not permanent, and she fears the idea of resetting, as whenever she dies and is replaced by a clone, she loses her memories. She fears ceasing to exist because of the connections that she's made, mainly with Shinji, but also wants to cease to exist at the same time because she didn't ask to exist necessarily. However, she can't just stop existing because she'll always be replaced by a clone. However, when she's finally presented with the idea that she won't be needed anymore, her fear prevails and she realizes that she, much like other characters in the series, wants to be needed. She wants to be an individual with value to others that isn't completely controlled by Gendo. And much of the struggle that Rei faces as a character lies in proving that she's not a puppet or a doll and that she has free will beyond Gendo. And so, with Rei and Shinji's relationship, Shinji was initially very jealous of Rei and her relationship with her father, as she was very close with him and could casually start a conversation while he could not. But that jealousy quickly disappears. Shinji has an attraction to Rei, not necessarily a romantic one, but this attraction makes him want to get closer to her. However, this attraction ultimately stems from him seeing her as a maternal figure. Shinji often draws emotions out of Rei, sometimes when she doesn't want them to be drawn out of her, whether it be because he's legitimately concerned about her or he's just trying to make a conversation in his own awkward way. But it's important to note that Shinji is seeing a maternal figure in what is otherwise a doll without a soul and has very little emotion. Just like many men in Japan during the 90s, he's seeking an alternative to a quote-unquote real person of the opposite sex, though he's still unaware of it until later on. And now on to Asuka. So, with Asuka, I think it's very important to understand this quote from her seiyuu, or voice actress. Asuka as a character is very much about hiding her emotions behind a wall, and coming off as a very prideful and independent person. She convinces herself of this when in reality she's very delicate and desires positive reinforcement or physical comfort from Shinji, as he is the man that she spends the most time with. So Asuka is a 14-year-old girl from Germany. Most of her psychological struggles stem from her childhood trauma, similarly to Shinji. Her mother went insane after an experiment with the Eva that Asuka would later pilot, and she believed that the doll that Asuka owned as a child was actually Asuka herself. Eventually, due to Asuka's father cheating on her and essentially abandoning them, her mother hanged herself along with the doll as she wanted Asuka to die with her. And so, Evangelion very much emphasizes that it's wrong for a man to run away from his problems. This quote from Asuka's mother encapsulates this theme perfectly and is very crucial to Asuka and Shinji's relationship. And so Asuka and Shinji's relationship is the main driving force of the story, and they're actually quite similar in many ways. Shinji lacked a mother figure and had an unhealthy relationship with his father, while Asuka lacked a father figure and had an unhealthy relationship with her mother. While Shinji seeks a mother figure in the women that he meets, Asuka seeks a father figure or somebody who can support her emotionally. Because of Asuka's desire for a father figure, she regularly attacks Shinji or insults him, usually directing the insults at his masculinity. However, Shinji is attracted to Asuka, but the problem here is that it's mostly sexual at first, as she often berates him for the smallest things and frustrates him by not being nice to him. But as Shinji becomes more confident, Asuka becomes less confident, as he's getting all the praise that she would want. And as Shinji becomes closer with Rei, Asuka begins to hate Rei more and more, because Shinji is giving Rei the attention that she wants. Additionally, she sees Rei as Gendo's doll, or his puppet, as I brought up before, and she kind of projects her hatred for her childhood doll onto Rei herself. And so, both of these characters are very much defined by their defense mechanisms, and are a perfect lens to view the Hedgehog's dilemma through. Shinji mainly runs away and isolates himself as a defense mechanism. He fears rejection and abandonment, so he always stays in his comfort zone, often connected to his cassette player and earphones, which allow him to ignore what's going on around him. Whenever he doesn't have his cassette player, he's really forced to face reality. Asuka, on the other hand, pushes people away with her abrasive personality as a defense mechanism. She'll regularly request that Shinji gives her attention or put herself in a position to be comforted by him, which kind of contrasts that. But unfortunately, he'll regularly fail to do so, as he doesn't want to get close to her. And so there was a lot going on in the 90s in Japan that would lead to the creation of a work like Evangelion. I already mentioned the issues of salarymen and the increase in sex doll purchases, but I believe that two of the other influences that were the increasing rate of mental health disorders in children and Japan's economic stagnation. So in the early 90s, an epidemiological survey was conducted on 874 children between the third grade and the third year of junior high school. And it was found that, quote, what is common to adolescent children of today who present with a depressive state is that they are sensitive to interpersonal relations, methodical by nature, and lose confidence with a certain experience as a cue. If this doesn't describe Shinji perfectly, I don't know what does. They also found that 20 out of 103 children between ages 13 and 18 had some sort of mental health disorder in 1990, and the numbers grew within the next 2 years until it was almost 1/4 of children in Japan, or of children that were surveyed. Japan had a pretty severe problem with the pressure they were putting on their children, and that manifested in the increasing rate of mental health disorders in them. In Japan, the 1990s are known as the lost decade very often. Japan had a very successful 80s, and they wanted to keep that going as they were afraid of decline economically. This eventually led to a liquidity trap and a credit crunch. Some of you are probably thinking, wow, that's terrible, and the rest of you are probably thinking, James, what the heck is a credit crunch and a liquidity trap? So let me explain. A liquidity trap is an economic scenario in which investors and households sit on cash. So basically everyone is sitting around and waiting to invest because they believe that services and goods will be cheaper tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. This caused widespread inflation. A liquidity trap can be broken by giving households and businesses a reason to invest and spend. And eventually Japan reinflated the economy by targeting and increasing the supply of actual money and not targeting interest rates like they had been previously. But this led to banks tightening their lending requirements and not lending, otherwise known as a credit crunch. There was already one of these before the liquidity trap, but they now had another one. Now, a credit crunch can be solved by having banks acknowledge their losses. Sounds pretty simple, right? However, banks didn't want to do this as they feared they'd lose control of foreign investors upon revealing long-concealed losses. So essentially what's going on here is that nobody wants to accept losses or flaws economically. This idea of not wanting to accept bad things that happen or flaws is very central to the end of Evangelion, particularly through human instrumentality. So, human instrumentality. This is the driving force for much of the series and the ultimate goal of Gendo Ikari, as well as the mysterious organization he has to answer to, SEAL. Human instrumentality is essentially a transcendental level of existence where nobody really quote-unquote exists. Instead, they're all one, and all of their flaws are complemented by the strengths of others, and there's no insecurity. All dead and living beings are included in this as well. And so SEAL wants to use this SEAL wants to initiate this in order to end all wars and suffering, whereas Gendo wants to initiate this so he can be with his wife again. Basically, it's crazy. Probably what some people think the COVID vaccine is going to do. I don't know. So now that we're really getting into the end of Evangelion, I need to talk about the infamous hospital scene. So for those of you who don't know what this scene is, basically at the start of the movie, Asuka has been hospitalized. Shinji needs somebody to comfort him as there's all sorts of chaos going on, and he's afraid to talk to anyone else besides Asuka because they're not really who he thinks they are. His relationship with Rei was severely damaged, specifically when he found out that she was a clone of his mother, because he was just really creeped out. And his relationship with his father is just beyond repair. It's completely destroyed. However, Asuka is completely comatose, and as a result, Shinji has nobody to talk to. He doesn't have his cassette player, so he has no real defense mechanism against the reality that he is alone. So he masturbates in front of Asuka. As I said before, Shinji's attraction to Asuka is mainly sexual. He doesn't like the rougher parts of her personality for the most part, though her insults have become a natural part of his life that he even longs for at this point, and it frustrates him that he has these two conflicting feelings for her. For Shinji, this is very much another defense mechanism, a way to avoid reality and reinforce his masculinity. It's quite similar again to the way in which Japanese men relied on sex dolls in the 90s. However, this is still his decision. He very much made this choice consciously. With nobody to blame but himself, Shinji completely shuts down. And so this indirectly results in Asuka's death, as Shinji is too late to save her later on. Though Asuka finally finds peace upon realizing that her Eva houses her mother's soul, Shinji is traumatized by this entire experience as well as what happens next. And so Rei ultimately decides who can choose to initiate human instrumentality, and she decides to give that choice to Shinji instead of Gendo. And the fate of humanity is now literally in Shinji's hands. Even though Shinji immediately decides to initiate human instrumentality anyway, Rei giving him this choice is very important, as it shows that she's broken away from Gendo, who mainly valued her selfishly as a tool, and she's realized that Shinji truly values her, and she's finally exercised her own free will. Note that Shinji is completely terrified at this point. His decisions aren't necessarily rational. And I mean, just look at this stuff. There's no way he wouldn't be absolutely terrified. And by the way, there's totally no sexual metaphor here. Just, pretend that you're not seeing this. And so, ultimately, after starting human instrumentality, Shinji kind of gets put through the ringer. Quickly realizes that human instrumentality isn't actually worthwhile, as the struggle of existence in itself is what makes existence worth it. And so he decides to stop human instrumentality, allowing others to return to Earth if they discover their identity and recognize their own free will, doing so himself. But upon returning to Earth, however, he realizes that he's not the only one there, as Asuka is also with him. I can't overstate how important it is that, of everyone on the entire planet, the two characters who have been running away from reality for the entire series choose to live in it. There isn't much of an epilogue, as the movie ends with this one beautifully ambiguous line from Asuka. But the message here that the answer to your problems in reality is to face them and struggle through them instead of indulging in escapism or being passive is extremely fitting for the time that the movie was made in. And here is a final little tidbit. We have these two pictures, one being from earlier in the series and one being from the poster of the end of Evangelion, where Shinji could previously not bring himself to stand with Asuka and comfort her, but now, after human instrumentality, he can stand by her side. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you for watching.